Okay. Catherine, just to confirm, you're ready? We can start.
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay. David Amito, kindly stop the background intro. Just put in the, you can put in the profile. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this first of the webinar series for 2023 from the Rural Forum Secretariat. For this kickoff webinar series, we seek to bring to you the issues around innovation and food security. And the first of this webinar series will be led by, will be delivered by Professor Catherine Nakalembe from the University of Maryland. And it's really focusing on satellites for food. And the idea is how may we utilize remote sensing and other technologies that can enable us as a continent to deliver food to our people. The idea within this is that as universities, we are resident and we are committed and we should be committed to delivering innovations that ensure that we can address the real needs of our people from the bottom up as well as from the top to the bottom. Basically that these new technologies and advances can help bridge the gap. Allow me to introduce, and in no particular detail that she will be able to introduce herself, but to hand you over to Professor Catherine Nakalembe to introduce herself in detail, but also to kick off the webinar series. Thank you very much. Over to you, Catherine.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Catherine Nakalembe. I'm I'm assistant professor at the University of Maryland, the Department of Geographical Sciences. My background is in remote sensing, primarily focused on utilizing remote sensing data for monitoring agriculture, which I started doing as part of my PhD, developing tools and methods for utilizing remote sensing data, as well as applications that include developing models with remote sensing data and machine learning to get the most value out of the different tools that are available, but focusing primarily in Africa. And the motivation for this is really the fact that agriculture in Africa is very unique. There are not a lot of places where it's similar, but it's unique in the context that we have a lot of mixed cropping. In some instances, we have a lot of agroforestry. In other instances, we have different agriculture practices by different farmers. We have very small fields, and a lot of the methods that have been developed largely around the world typically a focus on understanding larger scale conventional agriculture practices. So to give an example, a field in the United States might be many, many, many acres across, yet a smaller field, for example, in Uganda could be 2.5 acres. And so when you're looking at developing this baseline information for this particular field, it can be a little bit complicated because that field, that particular field is too small and there's a lot of things happening in that same space. And so to kick this off, I will sort of just give an overview of satellites for food. And then how I call it is basically it's kind of like, this is like a three-part session where we have why it's growing, then we have satellites for food security, and how is it growing. So I'm going to share my slides and then pick it up from there. Can you let me know if you can see my slides?
Yes, we can
It's
see.
clear.
All right, so I've already introduced myself. I guess the only other thing to add is I'm originally from Uganda, and my work is primarily focused on utilizing satellite observations for agriculture monitoring. And so just a summary of what we'll cover today is why is it growing? So why crops grow in some places and not other places? A lot of this might be very obvious to the people in this room, but I think it will help you kind of bring the global context as to why we focus on certain crops in certain geographies. And then the second part is looking at satellites for food security. So what we can learn from satellite data that helps with food security. And then the third is how it's growing. So how is, we might have maize, but how is it growing? Is it in a good condition? Is it, and how do we track that type of stuff over time? And so to kick off why it is growing. So the different agroecological conditions that are different across different areas. And so we have everything from temperature, rainfall, soil moisture, soil type, soil condition. There are other things like what might be accessible to farmers that might influence what they are growing in a specific region. So a crop like maize, for example, it requires temperatures above 15 degrees Celsius. This might vary by region, and in some instances, you might find that a certain kind of maize requires a slightly cold conditions to kind of start, and then it's slightly different at the end of the season. And then the second part is I think a second determinant is, for example, rainfall. We look at rainfall that varies over really large areas, but in order for maize to be a successful crop, it requires approximately 200 to 300 millimeters of rainfall per day over a 45-day period. And so it could rain it could rain extensively in 1 week and not another, and that typically impacts on the production of that particular crop at the end of that particular season. And so this consistency is really critical. And if you've noticed that when we're looking at crops, or when crops are grown, they're grown at certain periods, which is in some places referred to as the rainy season. And this is part of the driver for this. And so excessive rainfall, temperature, or fluctuations, or a huge reduction within that chunk of the growing season can have significant impact on production for that particular crop. And so for me to kind of show this information for you to think about it in a spatial context or complexity is we look at where maize is growing. So there's a data that I derived from a combination of satellite data, and the map on the top is just showing maize area as a percentage of total area around the world. And you can see that, yes, it's grown in many places, but it's not grown everywhere. And that's because of those driving factors that I mentioned before. And then the other thing is a combination of practices can show, for example, how huge the area that is under a specific crop is. So, for example, in the US, in the Midwest, up here where you see this dark green here, they're huge, hectares and hectares of land, and it's because it's done at very large scale. The bottom map is showing that even though maize is grown everywhere, the production of that particular production systems is not the same. So, for example, we see a lot of high production, greater than 9 tons per hectare in the same area that I was showing in the United States. And even though there's a lot of maize grown in Africa, you can see that the production is really low. So this is the yield is really low. So the tons per hectare. So from each hectare of maize that is harvested at the end of the season is a lot lower. And this has something to do with inputs, but there are a lot of other complexities that are probably not accounted for in these types of data sets, which is part of the motivation for me wanting to kind of focus on monitoring and developing methods for monitoring agriculture in Africa. And so to give another example, is we're looking at a crop like wheat. So wheat requires 15.5 degrees, between 15.5 C and 20 C. It requires approximately 100 frost-free days. So it can be cold, but there have to be days where they're completely frost-free. The rainfall varies between 300 and 1,000 millimeters, and it usually does really well in plains and rolling topography. So wheat is like, think about it like this lush grass that can grow over a really, really large, extensive area. And when we look at the map for wheat, for example, you can see that there's a lot less area in hotter regions and a lot more in sort of the wet and more northern latitude regions. So another example for rice, above 21 degrees C to 37 C, this has to be continuous over 3 to 6 months. So rice, you can consider rice as a hot crop. Rainfall varies between, it varies by region, but it's usually about above 1,000 millimeters during the growing season. And this is a lot of rainfall. And this is this other part about clay, loamy, and riverine alluvial soils. So if you're looking at paddy rice and not upland rice, you need to have this sort of soil conditions because rice has to be flooded with water over a certain period before you can get a really good production out of it. And so when we look at the production map, total area under rice is also really small. It's in Africa, it's largely in West Africa. And then you can see India and China kind of pop up out of the map. So if I look at those three maps together, and of course, going towards yield, you can see that yield is highest in China, for example. So when you look at all those three maps, it sort of like pops these ideas in your mind, and you can do this for many, many, many other crops. And so utilizing the satellite data, overlaying these different data sets, we're able to, one, get an idea of where things are growing. And in this case, we haven't, done any complex crop specific mapping, but we're looking at these agroecological conditions and then potentially reporting that has been done when you're looking at things like yield, production. And so there are other things that we can get from satellite data that are really critical. And one of the things that we're seeing as climate is changing, we can track impact of, let's say, warmer climate. Remember things like going back to wheat now, it requires temperature above 15 C, but up to 20 C. And if the temperature is 37, or if the temperature goes up to 37, this condition is no longer conducive for wheat, but might be conducive for growing rice. And so there is like this sort of not only a mind shift, but also a management shift where you have to know what is happening with your crops. And so we're able to kind of look at these things as they change in time, and then you can kind of determine whether your current agroecological zone supports the kind of crop that you want to grow. So can we grow maize in 2050? Can we grow maize in 2100 as it gets warmer or wetter and or drier? So those are the sorts of things you start to think about both in space and in time. One other part that is really critical is there are other data sets that can help when developed, can help in decision making. And so there are things a farmer needs to know, and there are things a policymaker needs to know. So in the context of a farmer might want to know when to plant, what to plant. And this is in the context of if the climate is changing, right? So they might still be planting the same thing at the same time, but due to climate changing, they might need to plant a little bit later, or the crop that they're growing is no longer suitable for what the season might look like. So we've seen a lot of like flood damage to crop fields or extreme droughts wiping out entire fields for places that was not the case in the past. And so then the next part is looking at things like soil moisture, soil type, soil moisture. So as the crop is in the field, tracking soil moisture can help a farmer determine whether they should irrigate or not, and by how much. Looking at rainfall, its forecast, current rainfall forecast for the season helps a person as a farmer plan what to do. And so at sowing, mid-season, and harvest, the farmer already has the information they need, or can have the information they need to plan accordingly or to adjust what they're doing based on what the forecast is. And so, okay, so, and to address that complexity across really large scales, global scale, national scale, sub-national scale, satellites are really useful. So being able to look at performance in large areas, like I showed the map before of the world, or it could be a county, and being able to look at that very granular level is really critical in terms of addressing the challenges, because a lot of the times farmers are operating on their own and do not have the right kind of support. And so satellites have a critical role to play in supporting the decisions they make. I didn't talk about specifically what policymakers do or need to know, but if you put yourself in the situation where your job is you're in the Ministry of Agriculture and you monitor food security, and you want to give a minister an idea about what production is, so that we can institute policies to improve agriculture production or institute policies to support farmers address challenges they face. If a pest is prevalent over really large areas, you want to know the extent of that, so you can, kind of coordinate with, let's say, a pest management department and share that information more widely. So satellites help in this case a lot, because we have this, what we call synoptic. So you can see from above, but you can see far and wide with this eyes. And so going to number 2, sort of diving in a little bit on remote sensing and its history. I'm going to spend probably the next 10 or so minutes, so I can leave time for questions, and then we can go into more details of other things on the next round of the webinars. And so since the 1970s, satellites have been collecting data over our Earth, monitoring our Earth. And so this satellite you see here on the left is Landsat. It's part of a series of satellites from NASA, and it's one of the oldest, one of the oldest land monitoring satellites for which we have data for. So since 1972, it has been collecting data from all over the world. There might be some gaps when you look at specific places, but that's because the technology at the time, and in terms of like data archiving and storage, there are gaps. But since the early 2000s, we have extensive everyday data in many, many places, in addition to data that are absolutely needed for monitoring agriculture. And so we have many systems that collect everything from rainfall, temperature, soil moisture. We have data, satellites that collect data at different resolutions, 10 meter, 20 meter. There are commercial providers that have a very high resolution data, 4 meter resolution, and at what I would call sub-daily. So sub-daily means more than once a day. And these become important if there's like a fast evolving event, like if there's a flood and you want to understand flooding extent. It could be really critical. It's also an emergency response. And so just to give you a view of what different agriculture systems look around the world from satellite imagery, and these are just pictures, except for one that I will show, which sort of looks at like a combination of bands to pick out a specific route. So this is an example of alluvial fans in Kazakhstan. It was captured by Landsat 8, and you can see, you can see the terrain as to how this agriculture is grown, and you can kind of sort of follow this region pretty clearly. You can see clear boundaries of the field. This is 30 meter resolution. And so that means that the agriculture in this particular region is at that scale that it can be monitored pretty straightforward with the satellite, in this case Landsat 8, a 30-meter resolution. It is not the same when we start looking at, for example, agriculture in Kenya. A 30-meter resolution is not a lot that we don't see. For example, those boundaries that you can see clearly in this image become really fuzzy. And that has implications for what we do during analysis and how we consider what the data are doing. And we'll talk about that in the next session. This is an example of Tadai, which is in Saudi Arabia. What you're seeing here, so part of what you do when you're learning remote sensing is just learning how to know what you're looking at almost instantly. So things like airports are very straightforward to see. So there's a line with like a little thing on the end, and there's always a building. But like agriculture that is irrigated is also pretty straightforward. So you can see those circles. If you've seen maybe a video, or if you've been at a farm that has agriculture where there's this thing that kind of spins around, is exactly why we're seeing that pattern. And what is interesting also, even in this case, you can find like some parts are planted and other parts are not planted. So you can kind of see dark green fields were planted quite probably a while ago, way before the lighter green ones. And then there's some gray ones that have not been planted. And then this is an example of crops in Kansas in the United States. You can see some irrigation. You see those circles, like where it's like circles. But in other cases, you can also see even the long fields might be irrigated, but they're not irrigated with the circular thing. The other thing is that you can see the fields are in completely different stages as well. Dark green fields being potentially at the most mature part of the season in this case. So the dark green kind of indicates very dense, healthy vegetation. And then you see the browner parts are probably been harvested, and this sort of like very ashy gray black are probably fields that are completely bare. So these are probably being made ready for planting or have been fully harvested. As an interesting one, these is showing rice fields in Vietnam. The data are collected, these data were collected with Sentinel-1, which is a radar satellite. So way radar works is that it can see through cloud, and different textures of different things become very vivid. So you can see if it's like a mountain, you can kind of see the terrain a lot clearer. But then you can also monitor things like water, very, very straightforward. And so typically rice is grown with water. And so it's kind of very easy to discern from other crops growing near it. So other satellite data, including temperature, really critical. Yes, we can monitor temperature right now and in the future and the last few months or few years. But I think being able to understand what that means going back in time over really large areas as it has warmed and its impact on crop productivity is really important, because it helps us plan for what might be coming ahead. And so if we were not monitoring these things at scale, we would never know which years were really hot. And I think I just saw recently an article came out where 2020, maybe 2022 might be now the hottest year on record or something like that. So we wouldn't know that if we did not measure temperature going back in time. But then if it's really hot, knowing it at scale, so knowing what parts of the world are getting hotter consistently is important. We also have looking at rainfall, so precipitation, evaporation, soil moisture, and runoff. And so usually runoff is just calculated as a difference between how much it rains and how much evaporates. So if there's a lot more rain than evaporation, then that water is either just lagging or is like sort of just like running. And this can be important for looking at things like flooding. So if you have to know where the crops are and it is flooded, you know there's extensive crop damage, especially if it's a crop that does not need a lot of moisture. We have one of the most utilized data sets is the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And this is one of the ones that's most used for looking at vegetation conditions. And vegetation conditions translated to pasture conditions can translate into crop conditions, especially when we know that what we're looking at in a particular area is pasture. And this simulation here is just showing the normalized difference vegetation index from this moderate resolution image spectral radiometer, which is satellites been collecting data, daily data all across the earth since the year 2000. And so we have over 20 years of data consistently over the whole world looking at the same, collecting the same data. And so combining rainfall, temperature, looking at rainfall, temperature, as well as what we call these agroecological conditions, you can develop a model that you can utilize to, for example, look at where crops are grown. So where in this case, where is maize grown? We've seen this before, but coming up with this map, it doesn't just appear, you need examples. When you utilize satellite data, you train a model to pick out where those crops are growing specifically. And so you can start to see differences. So if you look at maize, here's wheat, maize, going back to wheat, you can see very big differences. There's winter wheat versus summer wheat. So this is also in summer is like during the months of June, July, August, for example. And then going back to, this is an example for rice. So we can see that rice sort of is concentrated in this particular area. So to kind of wrap this up is like thinking about sort of what we'll go over next would be how is it growing? And I wanted to sort of be recognize that we're at we're 40 minutes into the hour, and I was wondering if I should pause here or if I can continue a little bit, but I think this might be a great place to stop, because then next time we will start to look at how is it growing. So looking deeper into things like how we develop cropland, crop type maps, and then utilizing this information that, for example, here we have rice. Yes, we have a rice map. So how do we generate that rice map? And then after we have the rice map, how we utilize data like MODIS satellite data to look at how it is growing. So we start to look at conditions. So is it growing great or growing bad, growing slow, or is it not growing at all? So maybe I think this is a good place to stop, and I'll probably hand it back to Professor Aguero to see if this is a good breaking point.
Thanks a lot, Kathy. I think probably it might be good to just run over to the next level and to allow the collection of minds in terms of questions, because actually where you are going now is the perhaps the most interesting part of the session. It's that part of how it's growing and where the skills development that will be required is really where I think there will be quite a significant number of questions and intuition from the many young people that have joined.
Okay, so that sounds good. So I will give a quick overview of sort of what we do if we're looking at how things are growing. And then in the next round, we'll spend a little bit more time, digging into like different tools and resources that are available if you really wanted to, take this type of work on and do it. And so first, to do that, I want to explain a little bit about the Harvest Africa program and where it comes from, because I think this would also help a little bit in this context. So as I mentioned, we've had data being collected since the 70s. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. Have been collected since the 70s. And so we have stacks and stacks. If you think about, every image that's been taken as a tile. So we have stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of images. In the case for MODIS, the daily images since 2000. And this is just a lot of data. So there are many things that have to be done. One, in the case of MODIS, for example, is what we call compositing, which is instead of having it daily, we clean the data and then it can become 8-day or 16-day, for example. So every 16 days, you can look at satellite data over many, many large areas. Instead of trying to look at it daily, because not a lot of things change about crop fields every single day, but absolutely every 8 days is a good place. And one of the reasons for this is like also trying to merge it with other satellite products. Okay, so we have the time series, we have the stacks and stacks, which we typically refer to as time series. You know, people are of course working in their field, but in order to extract the value out of this remote sensing, these stacks and stacks of images, usually you need to have ground data, and the ground data tell you exactly what is going on in a specific spot. And then we develop models to extract information about the same thing that is seen here to see if it is found in other places. So there are multiple kinds of data sets. One data set, for example, that normalized difference vegetation index is just a modification of the band combination that allows us to see vegetation as being bright green when it is healthy and mature, or when it's kind of growing, and then it is dark brown when it is dry or completely bare. So I'll show an image in the next spot. So that's like kind of a very standard given when you have data collected by MODIS. Clean out all the clouds, atmospheric issues with the data set, and you have something that you can already use without doing any excessive analysis with it. But then there are other foundational data sets that we need, and I will talk to these a little bit. But we need things like cropland. So the maps that I showed before where maize is growing, that's an example of a crop type map for maize. Cropland is just where all crops are growing. And then we need things like crop conditions, which can be approximated from NDVI, that normalized vegetation index, or GCVI, which is a similar index to NDVI. And then there's things like soil moisture, among others. And so when you stack these together, you can have a general overview of how a crop in a particular region might be doing. But to generate that crop land or crop type map, the example that I shared before, we typically use machine learning. And so combining this ground information with satellite time series data, you develop a model or train a model to pick out the same exact thing across really, really large areas. And so if this green plot right here was, let's say, wheat, and this here is maize, you train a model. So you give a model examples that this here is wheat. This is what wheat looks like. And there are several bands in each satellite. So to give an example for Sentinel-2, which is a European Space Agency satellite, we typically use 11 bands when we're doing analysis. There are other bands that we don't use, but the ones that we typically use for mapping, let's say cropland or crop type, are 11. And those 11 have different values for specific things, so slightly different. And so the band, the values, the features coming out of these satellite stacks for maize or for wheat are slightly different than for maize. And so a further simplification is that the band combination, the values for those bands, when we're looking at vegetation or cropland, it's very different than when you're looking at a built up area. So we have very bright pixels or areas when we're looking at urban areas. And so those are very different and can be distinguished pretty easily with satellite data using very standard traditional machine learning methods. And so from that, we extract, this was one way of extracting, example of extracting cropland and crop type. And then using the stack, for example, of MODIS data, we can look at crop conditions, and then we could do some sort of yield estimation that's based off how over a growing season, this changes in the values of that are related to production. So I related to yield. So if it's, a consistently healthy growing season, yield will be higher, but higher by how much? And so we always need ground data to be able to do that. And so just to show you some examples, this is the GLAM system. The GLAM system is one of the oldest systems that was developed specifically for utilizing satellite Earth observations for agriculture monitoring. When we have time, I will click onto this and then go and kind of show you what you can look at. But as I mentioned earlier, you can see that the darker green areas are areas that have dense vegetation, and the brown areas are areas that have either very little vegetation or no vegetation whatsoever. So you can see the Sahara Desert here, clearly being brown, and then you can see dark green down here in Southeast Africa. You can see very dark green areas in China, and then what you see here is very dark green in South America is the Amazon forest. And so, it's like these are some of the most basic, very simple things that are easy to discern, not only with the eye, but like when you train a model to distinguish the Sahara from the Amazon, it is very clear and very straightforward to do. And so there are other systems. This is another one. It's the Early Warning Explorer, developed by the USGS with the Feminine Early Warning System organization. And with it, you can look at historical rainfall, temperature, and soil moisture all over the world. But they have an Africa portal where you can go in and look at rainfall from, for example, the last 4 days, how it compares to the last 3 years. A lot of it is largely derived from this data set called CHIRPS, which is a rainfall data set. And it's combined or modeled with station data where it exists. And so in places where the station data are not consistent or don't exist, there's usually kind of simulated rainfall. But in other places where station data are readily available, the product is really, really good for looking at rainfall in the short term as well as going back in time. And then when you have all of these stacks of information, so let's say from the Early Warning Explorer, we looked at rainfall deficits. So we know that this season was really dry. We know that it didn't rain enough. We know that it was really hot. We know the soils are dry, basically based on the combination of the top two. And then we know that, a deficiency in rainfall will equal poor conditions for crops, which equal drought. And so some very basic things is basically looking at things like soil moisture anomaly. So this is just showing areas that are dry in comparison to the average. So the anomaly is current soil moisture conditions for the month of February or for the week of February 6th over the last 20 years or 5 years or 4 years. And just looking, so when you compare those, you can see whether it has, for example, flooded, or it's really wet, or it is really dry. And this is an example from the drought in East Africa in 2019, right before actually the locust invasion happened, that then flipped this. All the areas that you see as being dry became very, very wet later in 2019. And by January 2020, locusts were breeding. I think locusts were breeding around 2019 here in Yemen, because locusts need sandy soils, wet conditions, and then in areas where they typically lay their eggs, and then that equals them basically growing in numbers. And this is sort of what happened after 2019, after the drought. A few months later, it was extreme rainfall. Then a few months later, it was locusts. And so I talked about this too, that we always need ground data. So a lot of the work that I've done and keep doing is focused on ground data collection, particularly the project under which this work that I'm kind of presenting about right now, which we call Helmets Labeling Crops, is focusing primarily on this task. So collecting ground data across many geographies to represent the heterogeneity of agriculture across Africa. And so this is done many ways through research teams, through students doing it, but also done with extension agents, with agriculture offices in many countries around the world, and particularly in Africa for the work that I do. And then we've also kind of looked into collecting sort of rainfall temperature data, which can be used to calibrate other satellite data. We have worked on using drones for collecting this extensive data. This is an example of a drone that we were flying in Tanzania. This is Professor Caesar Tumbo from Sokoine University of Agriculture that we worked with extensively in Tanzania. But then we also looked at things like pests and disease. So we can't monitor this in space, except if we have extensive information on the ground about what's happening that maybe we can use to model what that might look like in space. And so this is my last slide for today, is basically that being able to look at these things in space and time using multiple eyes, but same eyes. So rainfall, temperature, soil moisture, vegetation condition, data, as well as just raw satellite data, getting ground data, which could be from drones, cell phones, weather stations, map over really large areas. This is an example of ground data that we collect a lot. This is an example from Kenya. When we combine it with models, we're able to generate products. So this is one of the most basic product. This is a cropland map generated using a machine learning model. And so in our next iteration, I can dive into a little bit more around conditions monitoring, as well as an introduction to some of the very basic using things like Google Earth Engine to generate map products or to do like basic mapping for something that you might be interested in. So I will stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. I think a lot of things have been raised, or you have raised a couple of things. But I would like to first go through, I think, the comments section. Then we can then be able to move towards the questions. So as I'm going through the comment section, the audience, kindly prepare your questions, or you might be able to type them in the Q&A section. But we may be able to allow, if you raise up your hand, we may be able to allow you to ask your questions. But please do formulate them when they are concise, so that we don't take a lot of time, in order to ensure that we can cover as many questions as possible. So overall, there is for Hosea, for Uganda, we need to have informed data to ensure timely planning in the various agroecological zones, and data informing rainfall events in the country, various parts of the country. More data on crops, be grown based on the longevity, I think. But generally, the question and the issue here is, Kathy, it's longevity of the season. So basically length of the growing season, the agroecological zones. What probably I just need to put across to you in relation to this is, how would a country like Uganda with 8 broad agroecological zones, but with 34 micro-level agroecological zones of significance, be able to deploy remote sensing and satellite data to ensure that, one, we can be able to provide that timely information for planting, but also information regarding the length of the growing season to farmers. Okay, Catherine is dropped off. But we can be able to, I can be able to probably wait as she gets back online. And if she doesn't get back online, then I can be able to try to take on some questions.
She's back. She's back.
I'm back. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much for getting back.
I'm sorry, it's the internet at the airport. I apologize. And I'd seen the questions actually, and they're still here. So I think you were talking about the one from Hosea from Uganda. I didn't hear the last part that when you think you're trying to frame it.
Yeah, I was saying that how can a country like Uganda with 8 broad agroecological zones, but 34 micro level agroecological zones as done by Wortman and Eledu, make use of this remote sensing data to be able to deliver timely information to farmers, but also enable that is matched across rainfall and the length of the growing season.
So it is a combination of things. I think one is actually some of it is very basic. It is just like intention and investment into trying to do this exactly, because the data that we needed just to build the baseline of doing this exists. So we don't need, for example, to launch our own satellite right now to be able to, move ahead. And so what needs to be done is one very focused. So there's also the combination of focused research questions around building data sets that fit within the framing of agriculture in Uganda, for example, looking at different agroecological zones and mapping them at that scale. So you can't map Uganda as all of Uganda. You have to kind of be aware of the differences in agroecological zones, so you can map for the right crops. And that you can look at them when they're in season. The other thing I think that's unique also in Uganda and in other East African countries, there are these 2 seasons. And so single season monitoring is not representative of the larger agriculture of the country. And so there is that investment. And then the other thing I think is the investment also to harness the power of the information that is in all the research that's being done, and then translating it into the context of what a decision maker needs. I think as scientists, usually we fail at doing that extra legwork, which requires translating the knowledge and information into actionable or useful things. And so having these monitoring systems accessible means that you can look at all these different places, but you need that additional context of very specific baseline information that can be generated by other researchers. So that's sort of my response to it.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. There's a question from John. How reliable is this satellite data with regard to food security? And how is the uptake of data by leaders nationally in the African countries?
So in terms of food security, so there's crop production, and then there is food security, and we'll talk about this in the next round. So food security is not only about what is being grown in the fields. Food security is a lot more complex than that. Food security means that people have food at all times and are not worried about, what they would eat and, in today, tomorrow, or the next few weeks. And so if you're worried that you will not be able to feed your family 6 months from now, then you're not exactly food secure. And so the satellite data can really, really highlight things related to crop production. And so we can monitor crop conditions, estimate yields, and this is just a component of food security. So there has to be production. And in some places, food security just means food being available at a market because nothing can grow there. And then the other part is that you can you have the income to purchase what is available at the market. So if it's available at the market, but you don't have money to pay for it or buy it to feed your family, then you're not food secure. And so in terms of the reliability of the data to monitor and track crop production, there's lots of studies, lots of examples, practical examples that show, its reliability. In Eastern Africa, the work that we have done, which I'll also share about in the next round, is being able to integrate these data sets into agriculture decision-making or processes by ministries of agriculture is a critical component. And this is sort of like, it's like layering on top of what is accessible to the ministry for them to have a much broader idea of what's happening.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. Then our next question is there any way agricultural extension workers in rural areas can access this data? Because they are always in close contact with the rural farmers.
So it's also two ways. This is where the other kind of investment component is. So agriculture extension agents are a critical source of information, not only for the farmer, but they are a critical component when you're developing a satellite-based monitoring system. So they can collect data, they can tell you what they're seeing and what it's meaning and its impact on the ground. So they kind of have to be integrated. In terms of accessing the data, there are many applications that are available that they can utilize. The GLAM system that I showed before, and of course there are limitations. So the GLAM system that I showed before, you can do these time series plot that tell you current condition versus previous years. And you can access it on your cell phone, but internet connection might be a limitation. And so a Ministry of Agriculture could, for example, just utilize that information to create summaries that maybe they send through WhatsApp, but that also requires internet, but maybe not a lot of internet. But this information could be further distilled into very simple text services that we can send the extension agents a text message that summarizes these things. And there have been so many companies and organizations that have developed things like these. So it's also goes back the same thing around investment.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. Our next question in this regards relates to the issue around their data availability and issues on software, where what software is freely available for vegetation monitoring?
So I think to answer this question, the best way is to encourage you to participate in the next webinar. I will include resources, point you to where things are. Majority, if like 99% of the software that I use is open source. Open source means that you can download and use it without a license. So things like QGIS, for example, for making maps in the end. But there's Google Earth Engine, which helps you access lots and lots of satellite data without you needing to have a fancy computer or computing cluster. And there's lots of materials, tutorials, all sorts of things that can kind of point you to what you're trying to do. In terms of what we do in our group, that's a little bit more complex and complicated. We use a lot of deep learning models for a lot of the analysis. And our code base for this is also openly available, but it requires that you have sort of a strong machine learning background. And this is, if you've been following a lot of what's happening, there's a huge demand and need for data science capabilities and understanding. And, this is something that I encourage people to kind of look into, but I'll share resources and I will point people to the GLAM system that I showed before. It's open and available. You just click on the link, go to it, zoom into where you're trying to look and plot all the graphs going back since the year 2000 for rainfall, temperature, soil moisture, vegetation condition, among other things.
Okay, Catherine, let me just check. There was some other few questions somewhere that I saw on the web chat. There's this question around, does the satellite data recommend the exact crops to be grown?
No, not the data on its own, but the combination of the data sets and this knowledge, which is a combination of local knowledge, extension knowledge, farmer knowledge, can determine what is the most suitable crop for a particular area. So yes, we can tell, the average rainfall over the last so many years, an average temperature, minimum and maximum temperature, and these are clear indications for what should be grown in an area, because it's wasteful for you to try to grow wheat, for example, in the lower lying areas, for example, in Kenya, where it gets so hot. And so, however, as climate changes, these conditions might change. And so being aware of that is another way of indicating what should be grown where. But it's also, there are so many other things that come with growing different crops. So there's like a huge management component. So if you grow a lot of vegetables, but you cannot store them to keep them fresh for the market, then it's wasteful. So even though you can grow tomatoes, it does not mean grow, a lot of, put a lot of acres to tomatoes if you don't have the infrastructure to preserve. And so it goes back to the question around food security, because infrastructure or around agriculture could mean so much for farmers saving their produce and being able to move it from place A to place B. So you may find a farmer might have their crop ready for harvesting, but the roads are flooded and they can't move it. And so there's that added complexity, but of course the satellite data can provide suggestions, max, mean, that are really useful.
Okay, thank you very much. I think almost one more last question is how I think Hassan must have could have intended to ask, how may we join the digital data and ICT with satellite data for boosting and monitoring crop production? I am just trying to paraphrase his question. It's the sentence is not very clear, but that's what I can pick.
Can you say that again? What was the sentence?
I think his question is, how can we join digital data and ICT data with satellite data for boosting and monitoring crop production?
So digital data, it depends what kind of data. So we have, when we collect cropland, crop type data collected on the phone, this is, part of the digital ecosystem. So those are digital data, and we get these CSV files or comma separated files. If you can think about it, like maybe an Excel sheet with like what we consider as ground data or labels. So that's like digital data. And then we utilize it to train satellite data to extract additional information. But there are other data sets about what's happening generally in an area that are reported using different tools. And so you can merge these into an agricultural monitoring system, or you can feed that information into a crop monitoring initiative that merges all of that information to get out the insight. So there's definitely, they're complementary to each other.
Okay, thank you very much. Two last ones. Audience, this will be the last two questions. One question is, can this data analyze the size of seasonal productivity risks? And that's from Alzia Fahi. And then Zebdi is asking, can this be used for environmental screening?
I don't know what, environmental monitoring or?
Yeah, I think that should be environmental monitoring.
Yes, absolutely. The same satellite data can be used. Yeah, the same data can be used for crop conditions monitoring. The satellites that I utilize that have collected data about, when we look at things like soil moisture, when we're looking at things like vegetation density, when we're looking at, you can utilize the same data. My background is actually in environmental science, and this is how I got into this. And I was interested in forest monitoring and conservation. In terms of, can this data analyze the size of seasonal productivity risk? I think this is going towards like, can you understand risks to production within a season? Yes, you can. And it's a combination of things. So within the season, so let's say we know where all the croplands are and we have mapped them out. And it's forecast to rain so many millimeters of rainfall over a really large area. You can estimate the area that will be impacted. A really good example in Vietnam, when they're looking at rice monitoring, one of the basic things they do is, okay, this is where all the rice is supposed to be grown. They do an initial survey with satellite data to determine who planted, right? And then mid-season, they check again to be sure that those fields that were planted have actually crops in them. And then based on historically reported production and the area that has been mapped out as planted this season, they can determine whether it will be, the region will produce 100,000 tons of maize this season or 200,000 tons, because maybe it's a lot less area planted. And then it goes further. If there's an extreme event that floods everything, or if there is drought that floods some part of that impacts some part of the area, but the total size, you can then determine that production is going to be reduced by X amount at the end of this season. And it could just be an indication that it's below or above average, or severely below average type scenario. But that information is really useful. It's way better than not knowing at all and then finding out that, oh wait, there was a big drought in the region that produces most of our teff, for example. So it's sort of like seeing over large areas and having insight into what might happen in the next few months that makes the satellite monitoring really powerful.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much, audience, for the engaging questions. I think in the next, this is going to be a webinar series. I think we will have the next round of sessions until we are moving towards how may we build capacity and how may we increase the number of practitioners on the continent that are deploying remote sensing and satellite technologies for aiding our food security processes. And indeed, for our processes now, when we are talking about agri-food systems and agri-food systems transformation, what role does do satellites and satellite systems have to contribute and aiding all these processes? So we will be going through some of these processes. Some of them may come directly from Catherine, but other part of the team that Catherine can be able to work, we can be able to work together to pull through the different persons. The idea is that we should be able to increase the adoption and utilization of satellite-based data to aid our planning processes, so that we don't have to do things by accident and hoping and praying to God that, all right, God already gave us the opportunity to control the environment and prosper in it. So this is part of the processes of us ensuring that as people who are within the space, we can be able to make best use of what is available. With all these many words, I would like to thank you very much. We intended to ensure that this session is 1 hour. We've short passed by 16 minutes. I would therefore like to end this session today. Thank you very, very, very much, all of you, for participating.